Hello and welcome to this first tutorial video on how to make April our button jointed hare. I've cut out all of the pieces for my hare. This is the back of the head, the two sides of the head gusset. There are the two outer and the two inner contrasting ear pieces, the two parts that make the body, the four parts that make the legs. These show particularly nice staining from coffee. I'll add a link to the coffee and tea staining video. The four parts of the arm, there are no paw pads, but there are foot pads. I've traced the eye onto the head side using a light box as I did in the ragdoll face painting tutorial. This little line makes the nose and you'll paint that once the whole head is finished. And these are my four brushes. I have a nice thin one for outlining, a brush for filling, and two stubbly rough brushes, rougher the better, for stippling. I've got titanium white and I'm going to keep that really dry, add a little bit to the brush, and then using a scrap of fabric dab as much off as I can. It's really important to get this almost dry, and then with a very upright brush, which unfortunately means it's a little difficult for you to see what I'm doing at this point, I'm stippling onto the eyelid here. I'm going to add a dark layer to the line, so at the moment we're just doing the white, so keep it on the outside of the line. This is just lifting the underneath of the eye. Again, dry it off as much as possible, and onto the eyelid again. We'll do this in layers, so don't worry too much. Most important thing is not to let it be too wet and to keep your brush upright at this point. I'm going all the way around and over the very top as well. I'm adding a little bit of burnt umber now because I want to make something that's a little creamier, that will blend that very bright white so that it is a little softer coloured. And that burnt umber and white mix is very versatile. It's what I use on the ragdoll face painting to create a really nice soft flesh, sort of soft lip colour, and the shading around the eyes on the ragdoll. So I'm just softening that white a little, obviously speeding this up so you don't get bored, taking it all the way around, bringing it forwards a little bit there and back a little so that it elongates the eye a bit. Just keep stippling it, don't be tempted to overload the brush. It's better to have to keep loading the brush and keep drying it off. You're not wasting very much paint at all, as you can see. It's only the tiniest little bit that we're using. This System 3 acrylic paint that I use from Dale Around, it goes an awful long way. The deepest part of your colour, and in this case the brightest part of the colour, is in the middle of the eyelid there. That gives it real highlight, and everything else is really soft. Now I'm going to use this thicker brush and a wetter titanium white, pure titanium white, to add the whites to the eye. And the reason we make this a little wetter, it's not runny. It's not like watercolour, it's still a nice dense paint, but we want to be able to add this without having ridges and bumps and lumps. And pure acrylic paint, when you're working it into fabric like this, can become a little lumpy. So we don't want that, so I've watered it down just a tiny bit to make a smooth white to the eye. And take that right up to the pencil lines, all the way around. And that's giving the white that we've added on the outside, those highlights, is giving that time to dry while we make a really thorough job of painting these whites. Smooth out any little ridges you might get and go right up to the outer line. For the colour of the iris, I've chosen yellow ochre and burnt umber, and I'm mixing those together. I want a kind of nice warm mid colour, so that I still have a lighter colour, my yellow ochre, to highlight, and a darker colour, which is my burnt umber, which I can use to add the muscles of the iris that contract and expand the pupil. If you ever get the chance to look deeply into somebody's eyes, it doesn't freak them out at all, I'm sure, but do stare often at strangers' eyes, because they're fascinating. We don't look at people's eyes often enough. So I'm just smoothing all of this out, because I need to be able to do some nice detailed lines. This is burnt umber mixed with water, very runny, so that I can use it with one of my thinner brushes to add shading here on the white. You want a little bit of shadow, so it's very soft and very watery in a line. It's such a small detail, but it actually adds real depth to that eye. Don't worry if you pull a bit of the white over your iris, because you're going to be deepening the colour of that in a little while anyway. Now that our outside bit is dried off, I'm stippling burnt umber on my scratchy little brushes, and I'm going to start deepening the colour of this crease that ran over the top of the eye. So we can do this now without it blending. It's going to sit in and blend in a sort of natural colour without actually mixing with the paint. So that's going over the top of the eye and underneath the eye, and it's bringing the eyelid down at the front a little bit there, so beyond the point of your pencil line and right up against the edge of the white. Don't worry if you go over the white a little bit, you can always go back and repaint that. So over the top of that crease in the eyelid and beyond, and on the top edge and the underneath of the eye. So all of those pencil lines we're kind of deepening now. This is over the top of the eyelid, and this is underneath on the lower eyelid. And then this is burnt umber, quite nice and watery, not too thick, not like the shading we did, but on my very thin brush to sort of, this is eyeliner basically. We're not going to be putting lashes on this one, but we do want to define that outside line. So right up against that edge, a nice soft thin line, not clumpy, don't make your paint too thick. And I'm just taking it down a little bit past that line. And then I'm doing the same here, following the line that goes up over the top, this crease for the inner crease of the eyelid. We will be doing more layers. Layering is so important here. It adds real depth on the underneath here, deepening that shading with a nice deep line on the underneath. If you try to do this all in one go with a thick paint, it would just be so hard to manipulate that you'd end up with it clumping, you'd end up with a very messy finish. Better to have a slightly watery paint and do it a few times. Just keep working it over. This top section is always going to be a little deeper. You want it to soften as you come to the outer edges of the lines. So just a little more around there. It's worth taking a little bit of time to see how your paint reacts with your fabric. So maybe before you start, you could do a bit of testing of how wet your paint can be before it starts to bleed into your fabric, how thin your paint needs to be before it starts to have real kind of texture, picks up the texture of your fabric. Right, next we're going to do a little bit more of that stippling with the burnt umber. Get it nice and dry, and again right over the top, shading over the top there, deepening that crease a little bit more. Keep loading the brush and keep taking a lot of it off. This is right up against the bottom line now. Don't fret if you go over the white. You almost invariably will, but you can lift that with a little bit of fresh white at the end. So slowly we're building up the layers, and those layers are giving us depth. If we could zoom in really close, we'd see all of those lovely different shades mixed together that we've overlapped. Now I'm going to take our burnt umber, pure deep burnt umber, this lovely chocolatey brown, and I'm going to add outline around the iris all the way around to give me a nice deep crisp edge. The deeper part of the colour of an iris is usually on the outside. So all the way around, a little bit over the top there to give us that shadow that we added earlier. And then, like the spokes of a wheel, we're going to go always from the outside to the inside. Now, if you can, always pull your brush from the outside to the inside. The way I'm working at the moment, it's impossible for me to access this from the other side or turn it, so I'm having to sometimes push the brush away from me, but you're better off pulling it. And now I'm bringing in lighter shades. This is my pure yellow ochre, so I'm doing that over the top to, again, spokes of a wheel, and there'll be layers again. It's never going to be exactly even. Our eyes never are. There's always variation and difference. Over the top again with the dark burnt umber. Just to deepen that. I want the final finished eye to have a nice crisp dark edge, so even though we do layers of yellow ochre, I always want to finish off with the burnt umber. Every time you add a new layer, every time you go over the top, you're blending and mixing and varying. A bit of white there just to cover the bits that are messed up earlier. And now the black. This is when this eye really starts to come to life. This is Mars black. And this is the pupil of the eye. The pupil of the eye is actually a hole under the lens. There isn't a black bit in our eye. It's where the light goes in. So it's a hole. The iris is like a donut, and this is the hole in the middle, so it really is quite deep and dark. There we're starting to see that really, really animate now. This needs to be nice and round. It's very important. It's all circles here. If you look at the shape that the bottom of the eyelid and that crease of the eyelid, it's quite a nice circle. I'm adding an extra bit of burnt umber for definition here. And then more stippling. I want to really deepen the smoky kind of shadow, because I'm not going to be adding eyelashes. So this is going to give me that nice dark outline that the eyelashes gave me on my ragdoll eye. A thin bit here, just tap, tap, tap it around. I can't get this thin a line with my very rough brushes, so this is a little thinner. And across the top. Just to finish off those darkest bits. And this to give a bit of shape to the outer edges of the eye. All the way around. A last bit of white, just particularly on that top of the eyelid and around. And then we're ready to add the dots. This is the bit that really does finish it off. 2 little dots. I always do a slightly bigger one at the top and a slightly smaller one underneath. Those are the two. Match them as best you can. You can see here I've changed the position of the dots because the light comes from one direction, and I've added a little tiny highlight there for the tear ducts. And I'm happy with that. I think that's worked quite nicely. Those bits you'll do when the head is sewn together. So now let's have a look at the paw pads. We're going to start off with a bit of white on the actual kind of soft pad bit there. So in exactly the same way that our pencil lines gave us an area that was going to be the darker area, and we did inside and around those on the face, we're going to do exactly the same with the foot pads. So first of all, stippling the lighter bits inside, and we'll do that on all 4 of the kind of toe pads and that back sort of heel pad. And texture's good. These bits would normally be kind of a fleshy, soft, like on a cat you have the pink kind of skin areas, and then you have the furrier areas around it. We want to give some texture, but we don't want it to be too furry. So let's just lift those bits up, highlight those. Next, again, we're going to load our brush and dry it, but we're going to stipple again around the outside. This is a little furrier, so the stippling can be a little bit more random. Just to add texture, this would be the furry kind of area around those pads. I'm keeping it mostly following the outside of those lines so that we don't lose all of the natural colour of the calico here. This is a raw calico, recycled raw calico. Take that all the way around the pads. Keeping your brush quite dry. Every time you load it up, tap it onto your scrap piece of calico, fabric, whatever. And we can go much lighter on this because it is a much lighter fabric. It's going to honestly depend on what fabric and what colours you're using. You might be exactly the opposite. You might be going really deep on your paw pads. But try and get them to blend in a little as best you can. There we go. Now I'm going to start adding some of the darker colour around on the pencil line, actually following that pencil line, stippling again all the way around, keeping your brush upright so that you don't have lines, you have dots, little dots around all 4 of the toes. And that back pad, it's a nice little heart shape on this hair. Might be nice to try a bit of colour in here. If your hair has a bit of colour, you can pick up the colour on the inner pads. Now I'm using my thin brush with my burnt umber to outline very gently, very soft, that pencil line that we drew in, the original pencil line, to give it shape. All the way around. And on each of the 4 toes. It's not the most accurate hair print, I have to say. I've learned so much about hares researching this pattern. They are the most fantastic animals and very endangered. Okay, all the way around. Deepening it in layers, slowly, slowly. And that's it, all done. Now once both pads are finished, just double check, make sure they match, adjust a little bit if you need to make sure that you've got 2 the same, and you're ready to continue. That concludes our tutorial video. I hope it's been helpful. If it has, please subscribe. We'd love your feedback and a like. There are more videos coming soon.